Welcome to Gnadenhutten, a village in eastern Ohio with a fascinating story to tell. It's the site of perhaps the most tragic event of the Revolutionary War, but out of that event came a reborn community of Indian and Christian heritage. Gnadenhutten was founded on October 9, 1772 by a group of about 40 Mohican and Delaware Indians who had converted to Christianity, led by Moravian missionaries in western Pennsylvania. They were part of a community of Christ-following Indians who moved to the Tuscarawas River Valley from a Moravian mission on the Beaver River in Pennsylvania. The Moravians were given the land by Gnadenhutten, chief of the Delaware Nation in the Ohio Territory. Gnadenhutten was supportive of the Moravians' desire to preach the good news to the Indians. The missionaries were forced to leave western Pennsylvania because their settlements were under constant threat by hostile Indians and white settlers. Gnadenhutten was the second of 5 missions developed by the Moravians in what is now Tuscarawas County. Overseeing the activities at the settlements was a missionary, the Reverend David Zeisberger. It was not a missionary, but an Indian convert named Joshua who founded the first Gnadenhutten settlement. Joshua was insistent that he be allowed to negotiate directly with Gnadenhutten for land on which to build a settlement apart from Shunbrook. Historians speculate that Joshua's desire for autonomy stemmed from cultural differences between the Mohicans and the Delawares who populated the Shunbrook mission. The first settlers were delighted with the location of their settlement, a broad alluvial plain settled 50 feet right above the Tuscarawas River. The group considered 2 names for the village, Nain and Gnadenhutten. Gnadenhutten, which means huts or tents of grace, was selected using the Moravian spiritual custom of drawing lots. For 7 years, the Gnadenhutten mission thrived. At its height in 1775, the settlement was home to 151 Indians and the families of the white missionaries. They lived in hewn log cabins. There were as many as 60 buildings in the settlement. The 2 main structures were the church and the school. Behind many of the cabins were fenced gardens. Gnadenhutten residents enjoyed a high standard of living compared to other frontier settlements. Many of the buildings had glass windows and basements for storing provisions. The villagers used pewter household utensils and were skilled artists and craftsmen, and they loved music. Joshua built a spinet piano, which he played as he led the singing for worship services. The village often attracted Indians and white settlers in the area, some of them drawn there by sheer curiosity. The fields surrounding the village were teeming with crops. Neighboring Indian tribes were shocked that all the men worked right alongside the women in cooperation. The settlement also had an abundance of cattle, hogs, and horses. Traders and travelers who often visited Gnadenhutten were offered hospitality, food, and shelter for up to 30 days. The effort by the Moravian Church to create a colony of missions among the Indian in the Tuscarawas Valley came to an abrupt end in September of 1781. By then, the deadly Revolutionary War had spread west right into the Ohio Territory. Hostility against white settlers escalated when Indian tribes sided with the British. The Moravian missionaries were suspected of collaborating with the Americans, a suspicion that appears to be true. It was due to this mistrust that a large group of Indians, commanded by the British, forcibly removed the converts and the missionaries from the settlements of Gnadenhutten, New Shunbrook, and Salem, stealing their belongings, killing the livestock, and ransacking the buildings. They were taken to Captives Town on the Sandusky River. There, missionary David Zeisberger, his assistant John Hecklewater, and several others were ordered to travel to Fort Detroit to be tried for treason. They were eventually found innocent. Those who stayed behind in Captives Town suffered a terrible winter of sickness and starvation. By late winter 1782, conditions were so bad that some of the Indian Christians asked British authorities for permission to return to the Tuscarawas Valley to bring back any food or belongings they could find. That proved to be the event that led to one of the biggest atrocities in American military history. In February of 1782, The capture of a white family by Indians near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, sparked angry settlers in western Pennsylvania to form a militia force to hunt down and kill the Indians. Their targets were the abandoned missions in the Tuscarawas Valley, where the marauding Indians found shelter and plenty of unharvested corn in the fields. On March 4th, a militia commanded by Lieutenant Colonel David Williamson set out from near Steubenville and arrived in the gnadenhutten area March 6th. The armed contingent approached the mission early on the morning of March 7th, killing Indians they met along the way. When they arrived in Gnadenhutten, they found most of the Indian Christians who had traveled from Captivestown harvesting corn in the fields. Missionary David Zeisberger wrote this account of what followed. The Indians expected no ill. The militia bade them to come into town, telling them no harm would come to them. They trusted and they went, but all were tied up and bound. The men put in one house, the women in another. It was announced that all of them would be killed in the morning for committing crimes against American settlers. After spending the night, forgiving, trusting, praying, and singing hymns, 90 Indian Christians, men, women, and children, were put to death by Colonel Williamson's men on March 8, 1782. 2 teenage boys escaped the massacre. At least one several weeks later gave missionary Zeisberger an eyewitness account of what happened. Before leaving the village, militia set fire to the buildings, including those in which the bodies of the Indian martyrs lay. The once thriving Moravian mission was reduced to ruins. After this horrendous tragedy, the area was avoided by Indians and white settlers alike. Over the next 2 decades, the Gnadenhutten massacre was a key point in the Indians' arguments with the whites, and it was always brought up in treaty negotiations with the United States government. John Heckewelder returned to the mission site in 1797, burned off the 6-foot-tall brush that had overgrown the remains of the buildings and the slain Indians, and he buried the bones in a mound, hallowed ground, which still exists today. A year later, it was Heckewelder who founded the new white settlement of Gnadenhutten. The village was to be a trading outlet for the Indian goods, made at the Moravians' new mission at Goshen, which was built on the Tuscarawas River just south of New Philadelphia. Heckewelder was instrumental in developing the first white settlements in Tuscarawas County. After leaving his mission work with Zeisberger, Heckewelder became a land agent for the Moravian Church. He directed the sale of Moravian land throughout the valley, on which many of the area's cities and villages were built. Heckewelder also served as Gnadenhutten's first postmaster, and it was his house that served as the village's first faith community facility. By 1799, the first Moravian settlers arrived in the area. A year later, there were 5 houses in Gnadenhutten, along with a general store and trading post and a blacksmith shop. David Peter operated the store and trading post. Settlers and Indians from miles around came to do business there or to just communicate and share news. Farming was the area's chief industry in the early years. Farmers brought their grain to grind in a hand-powered grist mill, which was placed on a post right in the middle of Main Street. Gnadenhutten's first schoolhouse was the church-owned parsonage, which was built in 1801. The school was parochial. The students were taught by the pastor of the Moravian Church until public schools were established in 1843. The Moravians built their first church building in Gnadenhutten on West Main Street in 1803 after the congregation was formed in 1800. The church site was moved to its present location, 133 South Walnut Street, in 1852. This building, known as the John Heckewelder Memorial Moravian Church, contains a private archive of written materials and artifacts dating back to the first village in the 1700s. By the early 1820s, most Indians had moved out of the valley as more white settlers moved in. The area's development was accelerated by the construction of the Ohio-Erie Canal between 1825 and 1830. 20 years later, railroads were built in Tuscarawas County. A depot and loading yard were located at Gnadenhutten, which further developed the area as a commercial center in the southern portion of the county. The local heritage is preserved through the Gnadenhutten Historical Society. The society operates the museum at the site of the original Moravian mission. The museum contains an extensive arrowhead collection as well as numerous historic artifacts and documents. On the mission grounds, you'll find reproductions of two of the buildings that were part of the Moravian mission. The church and the Cooper cabin are both built on the original foundations. It's believed these buildings were used to hold the faithful Indians who were massacred. A monument to the Indian martyrs is located between the two buildings. There is also a marker indicating the location of the cabin where it's believed the first recorded birth of a white child in Ohio occurred. Behind the museum building is the mound John Eckewater constructed to hold the remains of the massacre victims. Adjacent to the museum grounds is the Gnadenhutten Cemetery, one of the oldest cemeteries in the state. Here stand the graves of some of the villagers' first settlers, including the grave of Joshua, the Mohican Indian, who was the founder of the Moravian mission. The cemetery attracts visitors each year, particularly to view the older graves, which are arranged in the ancient Moravian choir system, with men buried in one area, women in another, and children in another. Gnadenhutten is also the home of Ohio's first outdoor dramas. In the village's sesquicentennial celebration of 1932, and in the 175th anniversary of the settlement in 1947, pageants were presented. The pageants were the forerunners of Trumpet in the Land, Ohio's oldest outdoor historic drama, which is performed each summer at the Schönbrunn Amphitheater in New Philadelphia. Trumpet in the Land is the story of the Moravian missions at Schönbrunn and Gnadenhutten. The village keeps its heritage alive each year with its special celebrations.
That's what I'm doing.
During the summer, there is the weekend 4th of July celebration with a parade and a variety of related activities. Also during the summer, Pioneer Days are held on the Gnadenhutten Museum grounds. Pioneer groups camp on the site of the first Gnadenhutten village, giving visitors a glimpse of what life might have been like at the Moravian mission in the 1700s. After the apple harvest in the fall, an apple butter days
That's what I'm doing right now.
is held at the museum grounds. You can taste delicious apple butter made the old-fashioned way. There are other foods and various crafts you can buy that you can take home as well.
That's when they do the auction.
December, you can drive through the museum grounds to enjoy a Christmas display featuring wooden likenesses of Gnadenhutten's first residents.
Never been here.
Gnadenhutten remains a vibrant community today, with the high school, businesses, industries, and banks. Also, the Brick House on Main, a quaint bed and breakfast is provided, and there are other nearby accommodations. You'll enjoy the shops, stores, and cafe, and the hospitality of citizens who rejoice in their community. Gnadenhutten, a village in East Central Ohio, with a fascinating story to tell.
Sure is.